Chapter 5, Line Standards and Layers, Joe Cerrone, CAD 116. I'm going to go through a quick lecture on Chapter 5. Our learning objectives are to describe line conventions. In other words, what types of lines are you talking about? Hidden lines, dimension lines, object lines. Concepts of layering in CAD. Essentially, we have these different transparencies that we'll use that are called layers. And so we'll create different layers for dimensions, object lines, center lines, etc. And then we'll describe how those layers are standardized and used in various occupations. We'll use the layer manager, and we'll take a look at the design center. Okay, as we look at line standards, standards are basically set up by American Society of Mechanical Engineers, architectural, in order to ensure that we can make things that are standardized. So we get into this alphabet of lines is what they would call it. And so you have object lines which are visible. In other words, they're straight lines with a line weight of typically 0.6 millimeters, and they're continuous. So what does that mean? Well, basically what that means is that when we work with a title block, and so for example, if we work with a mechanical title block like this one, what we would be looking at would be the way that the layers are set up. And so typically we have a layer for things like dimensions, center lines, object lines, phantom lines, and text. And then we'll put the different objects on those lines, on those layers. And by doing so, for example, we could turn off the text layer, and then you'll see that the text is gone. And we can turn it back on. And so there's on-off, which is our light bulb. There's freeze and thaw, which pretty much does the same thing. The only difference is one doesn't regenerate the database. And then you've got freeze and viewport, and you have lock, you have color, and you have the name of the layer. So we set up your title blocks with the layers so that everybody has the same layer names, the same line weights, the same colors for those layers. And then just some additional information on these different types of lines as you go through and learn how to read drawings or create drawings. A course in engineering graphics is a standard for teaching basic drafting terminology. So here's an example of a drawing, and you've got this this widget that kind of has a motion and it swings, and it shows you how the lines are represented. So when we have motion, we'll use these phantom lines to convey where that part would be if it was moved. We'll have object lines which are dark and continuous, break lines which show that we're not showing the entire object, we kind of break out a section. And then as we use these layers, we set up those line weights and those line types within those layers. And so if we take a look at our layer properties, we can see that we have these different line weights set up. So for example, an object line is set up with a 0.5 millimeter line weight, and it's a continuous line weight. And then we can also look at if we wanted to make that line a different type. Instead of being continuous, you click on it, and then you can change it. And so I could change it to hidden, and I can say OK. And then if I close this, now you can see that all the object lines on the object layer are now hidden. So it's kind of got a global way of setting the line types. And so if we come back here to the object line, and then we change it back, and we can also do things like change the line weight. And so if I wanted to make this super thick, you can see that that's super thick. Now, you have to toggle on the line weight to be able to see those changes. And so that's this little icon here, and you can toggle that on right here by selecting line weight. So if I want to set that back, I can go back to layer properties, I go to my object line, and then I'll set this back to 0.5 or 0.6. For years I've been doing 0.5 millimeter line weights for object lines, but now apparently the standard is 0.6. So be it. So we talk a little bit about what types of lines are used, like we saw on the previous page, and then layers and how they're managed. And so here's an example of a mechanical layering setup as well as an architectural. And so what you'll see is they have center lines, and then they have a center line type. Center lines tend to be thinner, 0.3 millimeters, and they convey the center of radial geometry or lines of symmetry. And then if we look at things like dimension lines, those are also thin, and they're used for putting in dimensions. Hidden lines represent things that are not within view and are shown with hidden lines, not dashed, but hidden. And so you have to choose the correct line type in the layer manager when you load these. They've added quite a bit to the layer manager. In fact, there's so much stuff in there that it's a little bit overly complicated. We basically just want to know the standard, how to turn the layers on and off. So let's take a look at this architectural drawing. And so if we look at this architectural drawing, we can see that the object is right here. If I go to the layer and I turn off this object layer, those lines will disappear. And I'm going to use a different drawing. Let's take a look at another mechanical print. And then if we look at our layer manager, we name the layer. So if I want to create a new layer, I can just hit this green button and I can say create new layer. Sorry, it's this orange one. It calls it layer 1, and I could call it, let's call it 3D. And then I can go through and set the color of that. And so if I want the color to be orange, I can choose orange. I can choose OK. And now lines will be drawn with that orange layer. It has a lot of little things too, like whether you can print with that layer. Line weights within viewports. And so we're going to go over general basic properties of it, which would be on and off. Okay, light bulb and sun. Okay, light bulb on, sun on. You can see the layers. Light bulb off, the sun will be blacked out. It turns into a snowflake. So this would be freeze and thaw. You will not see that layer. What's the difference? Very little. It just doesn't regenerate the database in the freeze and thaw. And then viewports are great. When we use viewport layering, what we do is we create a model like this floor plan, and what it allows us to do, this is model space, and what we do is we just put everything in model space and we layer it on top of each other. In other words, we can use the layers to see how the lighting plan will lay out, and so we can see if we have adequate lighting for certain areas. And we can also see other things like where the furniture is going to be. Oftentimes they'll do data cabling, you know, where the cables run for the computers and things like that. The way that we control the layers in this type of a drawing is with the viewport layering. So in the model space, I have all the layers, but in the tabs for the paper space mode, we can toggle certain layers on and certain layers off so that we don't have to look at all the other objects that we don't want. And so on the electrical plan, you can see that the furniture is no longer visible. Why? Because we don't need it for that aspect. And what you'll see is that there will be a viewport frozen for the furniture layer. So if I double click in here, now if I look at it, because I have to make the viewport active to see it, you'll see that there's a frozen viewport or a frozen furniture layer. It looks like I have two, so there's some redundancy here, but let's turn this one on. Now you can see it. And if we unfreeze it, and so this is the new way to do it. What we can do is we can create these books essentially from a model of the floor plan with all these different elements like heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, electrical, data cabling, and we can put everything into a model or model space where we can get an idea of where everything is in relation to everything else. And then on the layout tabs we toggle off the viewport layering for certain elements. And so it's a really good way to be able to manage drawings. You can select multiple layers, so if you want to turn all the layers off, you can click on one and right click, select all, and turn them on and turn them off. Kind of like holding the control key or the shift key like you do in the file manager. And here's our layer status. Current means you're drawing with that. And here's how we can choose the layers. We just pull them from there. You can set the layer colors. So for example, if I want to see what this furniture is made on, it's made on this details layer and it's black. If I want to come in here and change that details layer to some other color, I can change it to blue, and I can say OK. And if it's done properly, everything should update. And when I say done properly, what I mean is we're not overriding the properties, because we can override the properties. Properties is stronger. So if I just want this one line to be red, I can go over here and I can choose red, and then I can hit escape, and you'll see I have one red line. That's because it's no longer by layer. So if I click on it and then I come back here and I say by layer, that means it's going to be following whatever color the layer sets up. And the same thing for line weights and line types. You can always override them with the properties, but the proper way to do it is with the layer properties. Standard colors 1 through 9. This goes way back to when we had pen plotters. You'd put pen number 1 would be red, color number 2, and so back in the day when this stuff was first coming out, we'd have these pen plotters, and then you'd have these different colors that we could work with. And so if I were to look at my layer properties and I grab a color here, color number 1, red, 2, yellow, 3, green, 4, cyan. And so those were your first standard colors, and then they, as computers developed and the software developed, we just added more and more. We've already talked a little bit about the line weights. When you work with line weights, you need to load them. And so it'll have like 4 or 5 line weights that are loaded, or line types, but there's a whole bunch of them. And so you can come back in here, and if I go back to this drawing right here, and then I look at my layer properties for the details, and if we decide that we want to change the line type, what we're going to do is to go into our layer manager and then click on line type, and then we can say load, and now you can load all these different line types. So I could load it, let's say for example I wanted to use a gas line, and I can say OK, and then I set it current by selecting it again in the smaller box. Now you can see it's been updated, and then you can see my drawing is now made up of all these gas lines. Undo. Hidden layer, hidden line type. Setting the line type scale, and this is something that you'll experience when you do architectural work, not so much with the mechanical, because the scales are quite a bit different. When we work on architectural drawings, we're working on something that's like 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, and so we're representing a very scaled down version of it. And so what you need to do when you work with different line types and line, it's called LT scale, is you need to be able to set it so that they appear at the correct perspective. And so you can see it has these hidden lines for these office wall partitions. Now if I go and I change the LT scale by typing in LT scale, and I change it from 0.5 to let's say 10, now it looks like those lines are no longer hidden. LT scale, and I'll say 0.5. And so it allows you to adjust the scaling or the space between the dashes. And the way that you do that by the book is it's the inverse of the plot scale. And we'll talk about that at another option, another time. You can set layer transparencies. You can have them so you can kind of see through them. I really don't use that a lot. But if you have big filled in things with shading and things like that, you can use some transparency. Like for example, in one of the exercises we did a brick pattern, and then we put a color swatch behind it, and you could use a transparency value on that so that you can see the bricks, and then you can see through the bricks and see the color of what color you decide to make the bricks. In the layer manager, you can set certain layers that will not plot, so you can put notes in there and things like that. Turning on and off layers, light bulb on, light bulb off, freeze and thaw, they basically do the same thing. It's just whether or not they regenerate the database. When you lock a layer, it allows you to see it but not erase it. Kind of fades the screen a little bit, and so they talk about layer fading. And so if I come back here to one of my drawings and I decide to lock the layer, I can go in here and I can hit the lock, and then when I click on it, everything is a little bit lighter. But here's the thing, I can't select it or I can't erase it. I guess I can select it, but if I try to erase it, it's on a locked layer, and so it will not do it. It should not have done it. Anyway, pretty sure I did it right. And so that's an example of layer fading. And you can delete layers. You can just right click on them, or you can select delete or hit the delete key. Layer filters, this is getting into some advanced aspects. We'll cover that into an intermediate course. And then here's your status. You can just see if the layer is on, if it's frozen, etc. Oftentimes you'll open a drawing and some of the layers will be off because you don't need that information for everything that you're doing when you start to work on things. Just more tips and tricks with layers. Design Center is really very nice. It allows you to kind of visually insert blocks and manage content. And so Design Center is really great because it allows you to open up somebody else's drawing and take all the content out of it and put it into your drawing. And so things like dimension styles, layers, line weights, anything that has a name, you can bring into the drawing with the Design Center. Most people will use it to insert blocks, and so you can see these doors and architectural symbols and things like that. But it also does a great job for bringing in things like layers. And so if you open a drawing from somebody else and you need to create some more geometry for it, it's much quicker to select layers and import them in Design Center than it is to go through and create them one at a time. And these are just some of the navigation on the Design Center. And here's our chapter review asking us to identify these different line types. A would be a continuous line, B a hidden line, C is a center line, and then these are dimension terminology: extension line, dimension line, leader, hatch pattern, section line, break line, phantom line, dotted line. So as we look at our drawing, and if we were going to look at the Design Center is under the Insert, and I'm just going to type DC for Design Center. And so what Design Center allows me to do is kind of manage my content. And so, for example, if I go to one of my AutoCAD drawings, here we are, and if we go to, I believe it's in Module 2. In Module 2, down here is Design Center content, and AutoCAD has updated this. They've made it more online, but the old version I really like, because if you download this and then you uncompress it, you have to uncompress it. It won't unzip the files for you. So this is my content, and what you do is you put all your drawings into a folder, and then what they've done here is they have like groups of drawings. And so, for example, kitchens, if I open that drawing, what we get is a block library or a template library. And so we have all these different stoves and ovens and refrigerators that we can then insert as a block. Now, what you do is you put a drawing with all your appliances in it, and then you use it with Design Center. And so, for example, if I go to one of my other drawings, let's say I'm going to work on my floor plan, and I'm going to go to my floor plan here, and then I want to insert something. I'm going to go to my Home tab, and then I'm going to say DC for Design Center, and I'm going to open the file. So if I open the Design Center file, for kitchens, and it opened the drawing. I wanted to open just the Design Center. Let's try that one more time. So while I'm in the drawing, I'm going to go into Design Center, and then I'm going to open that. And so I had to put this on my desktop. It just could not find it. So as you can see, it has the other drawings, and so things like HVAC, House Designer, Home Space Planner. I'm going to go with the Home Space Planner. Well, let's do kitchens first, because if I open that in the Design Center, I can then insert blocks, dimension styles, layers. If I go with blocks, I can then come here and I can say, okay, we're going to change this around. We're going to put a oven. Let's put it right back here in this room. Make this into a kitchen. And then we can bring a refrigerator, kind of drop that in there. And so it's very easy and very fluid to be able to have a set of standardized symbols that you can use and then insert them into the drawing. This one's at the wrong perspective, so I'm going to take that one out. But as you can see, Design Center is just a smart way to insert blocks and things like that, layers and line types. Okay, so that completes the module or the chapter review, layers and line types, line standards and layers.